The first thing I remember is the way the dust lifted when she stopped at the gate. Not hurried, not hesitant either, just a soft pause, like she knew the land needed a moment to notice her before the people did. The sun was low enough to bruise the sky, turning everything copper and tired, and I was leaning against the fence with my hat pulled down, counting reasons not to care. That's when I saw her, standing there as if she'd been standing all her life, waiting for a door that might never open. She didn't call out, didn't wave. She just waited until I looked up. I've lived long enough to know that some moments don't announce themselves. They slip in quiet, wearing ordinary clothes, and if you blink, you miss the turn your life just took. Back then, I didn't know that was one of those moments. I only knew I was tired, widowed, and done believing the world still had surprises left for men like me. "Sir," she said when I finally walked closer. Her voice was steady, but it carried the kind of care people use when they've learned the cost of being careless. "I was told you might need help. Any kind." Her eyes met mine without challenge. That alone unsettled me. I told her no. I told her I didn't hire women. I told her the ranch barely fed the hands I already had. None of it was a lie. Still, the words felt heavier than usual as they left my mouth, like they wanted to stay unsaid. She nodded. Once. No argument. No pleading. "Thank you for answering," she said, as if I'd given her something instead of taking it away. She turned then, and I watched the way her shoulders stayed straight, even as she walked back down the dirt road, dust clinging to the hem of her skirt like it didn't want to let her go. I told myself that was the end of it. Told myself a man doesn't survive out here by opening every gate that creaks. By sundown, the town had already decided who she was. Mrs. Hawthorne's boarding house windows were always open, and her opinions traveled faster than the wind. A woman alone, no ring, no family to speak of. People filled in the rest with their own small fears. I heard her name pass like a warning. Eliza May Carter, spoken softly at first, then sharper like it had learned how to cut. I saw Eliza that night behind the livery, eating bread she'd probably been given out of pity. She ate slowly, carefully, like wasting crumbs was a sin she couldn't afford. When a group of men passed, laughing too loud, she pulled her shawl tighter but didn't look down. Pride could be a quiet thing. It doesn't always roar. The next morning, I found her in my lower pasture. She was brushing one of the younger horses, the skittish grain nobody else had patience for. Her movements were calm, unhurried. She spoke to the animal in a low murmur I couldn't hear, but the horse leaned into her hand like it recognized safety when it felt it. That was the first crack in me. Not her being there, but how gently she took up space. I said no. I told her. She didn't flinch, just nodded again. "I know. I'm not asking to stay. I was offered a meal if I helped here a while." Her sleeve slipped as she worked, and I saw the marks then. Old ones, not fresh enough to ask about, not faded enough to ignore. My eyes dropped before she noticed, shame blooming in my chest for seeing something she hadn't offered to show. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the rhythm of her work. Finally, I said, "You can clean the stalls. Just for today." She thanked me like I'd handed her gold. Days passed. 1 became 3. 3 became a week. Eliza didn't ask for more. She arrived before dawn and worked until the light thinned. She ate what was offered and nothing extra. When my hands fixed a fence, hers mended what broke behind it. She had a habit of humming, soft, almost absent-minded, and I found myself slowing my steps to hear it. We didn't talk much. Conversation felt unnecessary, like it might disturb the fragile balance we'd found. Still, there were moments, passing a cup of coffee, sharing bread by the fire, where silence felt companionable instead of empty. I hadn't felt that in years. At night, she slept by the hearth, fully dressed, boots close enough to reach without thinking. Once, I woke to find her staring into the fire like it was a doorway she hadn't decided to walk through yet. She noticed me watching and looked away, embarrassed by the intimacy of being seen. That was when it struck me, not as a thought, but as a weight settling deep in my bones. This woman had learned how to survive by becoming smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. And somehow, without asking, she was teaching me how much damage comes from looking away too long. I didn't know her story then. I only knew that something in her presence was undoing me slowly, gently, the way water reshapes stone. And standing there in the firelight, watching her guard her rest like a precious thing, I realized that whatever I thought I'd lost to the years, whatever parts of me I'd buried with my wife, were beginning to stir. I just didn't yet understand what my eyes were about to learn. Morning came soft after that, the kind that didn't demand anything from you right away. The light slipped into the kitchen like it was unsure whether it belonged there, catching the rim of Eliza's cup as she warmed her hands. We worked without speaking, moving through the hours the way two people do when silence has already said what it needs to. I learned her rhythms then, how she paused before lifting heavy things, how she stood still after finishing a task, as if listening for something inside herself. Loneliness, I'd learned, makes a sound. You don't hear it until someone quieter shows you how. It happened by accident. Those things always do. The creek ran high that afternoon, swollen from late snow melt, the water catching the sky in broken pieces. I'd gone down to fix a fence post the last storm had loosened, not thinking anyone else would be there. When I heard the splash, I turned to quickly. She stood at the bank, sleeves rolled, dress loosened at the collar, skin marked in ways no time should have allowed. Lines where rope had once been, pale ridges where fire had kissed flesh and stayed too long. I looked away at once. The shame of seeing without permission burned hotter than the sun on my neck. I muttered an apology she didn't hear and left before the moment could bruise her further. But I carried those marks back with me, each one lodging somewhere behind my ribs, rearranging what I thought I knew about pain. That night, I sat alone on the porch long after the lamps went dark. I thought of all the times I'd said nothing, of how easy it was to let cruelty pass when it didn't knock on your own door. I believed myself a good man simply because I wasn't a violent one. Seeing her scars taught me how small that belief had been. The town, of course, did what towns do when something fragile dares to endure. Deputy Willis came by 2 days later, hat tipped back, eyes sharp with borrowed authority. He asked questions that weren't his to ask. Where she came from, why she stayed. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice floated down the street behind him, full of practiced concern and well-fed suspicion. Eliza stood a step behind me, hands folded, face calm the way people get when they've already survived worse. She's working, I said. That's so? The deputy replied. Folks are uneasy. I felt it then, the moment where a man decides what kind of weight he's willing to carry. I didn't raise my voice, didn't threaten. I just stepped aside enough that Eliza was no longer hidden by my shadow. She works for me, I said again. And that's all there is. The silence that followed wasn't defeat. It was something closer to recognition. The deputy nodded once and left. Mrs. Hawthorne's window closed. The street exhaled, disappointed but restrained. Eliza didn't look at me until they were gone. Thank you, she said. Not relief. Gratitude. There's a difference. That evening, the wind came up sudden and cold. We sat near the fire, the space between us smaller than it had ever been, though we never crossed it. After a long while, she spoke. I won't tell you everything, she said softly. Some stories don't get better when they're told. I don't need everything, I answered. She nodded, eyes on the flames. I stayed where I shouldn't have because I thought endurance was the same as worth. It took a long time to learn the difference. Her words settled into me, reshaping old griefs I'd carried like truths. I told her then about my wife, about how love can vanish without warning and leave a man afraid of what might grow in the empty space. We didn't reach for each other. We didn't need to. The understanding was already there, steady as the fire. Spring came slow that year. It always does after a hard winter. The land softened inch by inch, and so did we. Eliza stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she chose to. She began wearing lighter colors. Sometimes she laughed, surprised by the sound of it. Once, as we walked the fence line, her hand brushed mine. Not an accident, not a promise either, just an offering left open-ended and honest. Years have a way of teaching you what matters. Looking back now, I know this. Love didn't arrive like thunder. It came like rain after dust, quiet, patient, undeniable. And if there's something I've learned that's worth passing on, it's this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand still long enough to truly see someone. Sometimes dignity is restored not by grand gestures, but by refusing to look away. If you've ever felt unseen or unworthy of gentleness, remember this. Healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply shows up, asks for work, and waits to be noticed.